democracy. And the spirit of democracy is a spirit of dialogue. It's a spirit of mutual respect. It's a spirit that kind of rests on a very precious and fragile ideal. And that ideal is the incalculable value of every human being. In education, what it means is not only that we develop a pedagogy of dialogue, that is a pedagogy where we listen with the possibility of being heard. Listen with the possibility of being changed, but speak with the possibility of being heard. That's what really powers good classrooms. And I think that that's the kind of spirit that is, again, diminished, not just in classrooms, but everywhere. So to me, as an academic, but also as an educator, we have to kind of push forward the notion that democracy requires dialogue, and that in a democracy, the full development of each person is the condition for the full development of all of us, and the fullest development of all of us is the condition for the full development of any one of us. That kind of spirit is something that we have to revitalize and re-energize and push to the front in the public conversation. Yeah, democracy by its nature is dialectical. I said it was dialogical, but it's also dialectical in the sense that whatever new consensus we arrive at, we have to look and examine and rethink and wonder. That's why what's marvelous about the ideal of democracy is the notion that it's never finished. It's a project always in the making, and it requires certain things to be vital and robust. One of the things it requires is an alert and attentive citizenry. It requires people to pay attention. It also requires the arts, and this is something that's often left out in discussions of democracy and education. But if we can't imagine what a more participatory, a more egalitarian, a more just world would look like, then it's very hard to move toward it. I love the slogan of the World Social Forum, "Another world is possible." And you think of that in contrast to the deathless phrase of Margaret Thatcher, who said, "There is no alternative." Well, exactly. If there's no alternative, what's the point? We simply get up each day, we march in kind of our habitual way to our habitual workplace, and there we are. But what the arts introduce is the possibility of seeing the world as if it could be otherwise. That opens up a space for real democratic thinking. And when we achieve the next equality, the next plank of social justice, we don't sit and settle on that and settle into a kind of a new dogma, but rather we wonder what's next, what else, what more. And if you look at things like in the world we're living in today, I mean, to see democracy present itself in the streets of Cairo and throughout the Arab world, and then to present itself in Madison, Wisconsin. And I just got back from Greece and spent 2 days in Parliament Square, where tens of thousands of people were rallying night after night with a simple demand, and the demand was for the parliament to leave. They were taking sustenance and energy and imagination from the Arab Spring, but there they were in Greece and in Spain now, making demands on the government and creating, through their activity, a public square. I think that's worth underlining as well. The public square isn't something that exists out there in a static form and that we enter it simply by walking in from stage left. It's not like that at all. It's something that emerges when people face one another authentically, without masks, without guards up, and they say, the way we're living is not adequate. The way that we are defined is partial. We are more. We could be more. And the events in Cairo recently, the events in Mississippi 40 years ago, were events where people who had been defined in one way stood up and said, "Don't define me that way. I'm redefining myself for myself." And that's where I think democracy becomes a living force and not a simple formality. Do we have a responsibility, all of us, to enter into that space? We do. What this means, though, is not that we enter in as requiring our students, for example, to bow down to a certain orthodoxy, or requiring our students to participate in a particular way. But it seems to me teachers in particular have a responsibility to enter into the public debates, enter into the public dialogues, precisely because we should show our students how it's done. That is, we can't say democracy is a great thing, but I, on the other hand, am holding back because I have some, institutional responsibility or some precious academic or disciplinary responsibility that prevents me. Simply because I'm a medical doctor doesn't mean that I don't have opinions about war and peace. I do, and I want to express those. It would obviously be crossing a line if we required our students to agree with us, but it's not at all crossing the line to be willing to say, this is what I believe, this is what I think. So I think that the calls for academics to be neutral or objective or to stay within their disciplinary boundaries are kind of calls by themselves that undermine our real responsibility as citizens, as participants in a free society. Education rests on the notions of enlightenment and liberation. And while you would be foolish, as Howard Zinn once pointed out, if you were a metallurgist, you'd be foolish if you were cooking the books in terms of measurements and so on. But you would not be foolish at all if you said, I believe in plowshares and not in swords. That doesn't undermine your credibility as a metallurgist at all. And the same is true with notions of objectivity in the classroom. If objectivity is to mean anything in a classroom, it must mean pursuing the truth, wherever that takes you. It must mean considering all sides of everything and knowing that there's still more to know, even when you reach the end of a discussion. To say there's two sides and we should endlessly quibble is ridiculous. We should be pushing towards what we take to be the truth, even as we know that our push in that direction will fall short. But that's not discouraging to me. That's encouraging. That means there's always more to do, more to think about, more to see. I said earlier that the attacks on kind of freedom of speech and freedom of thought are everywhere, but of course one of the major attacks is kind of the dogma of common sense. I mean, we become stultified when we accept a certain orthodoxy. If you remember the wonderful novel by Ray Bradbury called Fahrenheit 451, and this was a novel where the fire department went out and burned books. It was a future dystopic society, and the fire department's responsibility was to burn the books. And the fire chief at one point is asked why they burn books. And he says, it's not anything about orthodoxy or keeping the powerful in power. It's simply about the fact that the people demand that we burn books because the books are too complicated. They're filled with adjectives and adverbs and a string of various ideas, and it just makes life too complicated. Better to be simple. And that's true if you think about it. Orthodoxy, it requires a kind of simplicity, and complexity, opposing ideas are always the enemy of orthodoxy. So it seems to me that our job as citizens, as academics, as intellectuals, is to always make things more complicated. When I think of this, I think of the basic notion of teaching the taboo. And the taboo is never simply something weird or off kilter, but it's teaching what we don't know. And there's a paradox there. It's teaching how to question, how to queer the common sense, how to ask the next question, whatever the topic is, whatever we're looking at and thinking about. It's the next question that's interesting. So there's been a lot of attacks on kind of academic freedom. Joel Westheimer can speak about this, certainly. At Columbia has been an absolute feast of attacks, from Rashid Khalidi to Nadia Abu-Lughod, all these kinds of crazy mounting of attacks, and they get fought back. But the problem is fighting them back is also often misunderstands the terms of the discussion.